Welcome back, AP Psychers. In today's video, we are going to continue our installments that review the psychological approaches, the color-coded columns in the back of the class. And today we will briefly overview the green color-coded column in the back of the class, the biological perspective in psychology. And again, we'll follow the same format as the past two videos. Key topics, which is essentially a fancy way of saying what would a biological psychologist study if they were to walk into a daycare or a gym or the mall and observe individuals. Biological psychologists aren't going to do a lot of observation. They're going to do a lot more hands-on research. But nevertheless, topics that you would study. There's really not many key psychologists from Unit 5, but we'll nevertheless mention at least one of them and briefly talk about therapy. I know that's been removed for 2020, but I think it adds more context to an overall understanding of the biological perspective. The first topic under the biological perspective is neuroscience. I didn't use the word neuroscience a lot back in Unit 5, but that's basically a reference to the neuron and everything about the neuron, which would then mean the neurotransmitters. So, for example, a topic that a biological psychologist might focus on would be whether or not neurotransmitter levels affect behavior, which is certainly a massive topic back from Unit 5. The overall structure of the neuron and what functioning neurons enable, or what neurons that are having deterioration over time, perhaps to myelin sheath, might cause. So that's good examples of things that would fall under neuroscience. And then obviously, certainly the brain falls under that category as well. All of those brain regions, brain function, areas of the brain when injuries occur, all of that are topics that neuroscientists under the biological perspective of psychology would look at. So, for example, if you were asked, what might a biological psychologist focus on, one appropriate response could be areas of brain function, whether that's just tracking brain function, like during an emotional situation, for example, the amygdala is probably going crazy. When an individual is reading a book, perhaps their occipital lobe, the region of the brain in the cerebral cortex that processes visual information, is certainly going to be active. Those are all topics that neuroscientists look at. Another one that falls under this is genetics. This starts to branch just a little bit into the evolutionary perspective, which we're going to get into in the next installment, but certainly just genetics as a whole, definitely a subject matter that a biological psychologist would look at. One method that a biological psychologist might use are twin studies. Now, there are certainly numerous occasions throughout this course where we've referenced twin studies, whether that's in the context of personality, predispositions regarding psychological disorders in the clinical psychology unit, intelligence, etc. But if you were to see a question and it asked, what would a biological psychologist focus on in this scenario? Brain function as a whole, neurotransmitter levels, just the structure and function of the neuron would all be appropriate answers. Theoretically, you could also approach that with twin studies under the genetics. This unit only really had one key psychologist, and I don't envision his name being referenced, but you might see Mike Gazzaniga. He was the individual that conducted the split brain research. So you might remember those scenarios where the cat is flashed to the left hemisphere and dog is flashed to the right hemisphere. In the context of a split brain patient, what might they be able to identify with one hand or say out loud or draw? All of those scenarios were regarding the work of Mike Gazzaniga. He would be really the key name from this unit. In terms of therapy, I know it's not on the AP exam, but I think it's useful to write sort of the pharmaceutical approach. So we're going to be talking about, medicine. So whether that's something like Prozac, whether that's something like lithium, whether that's an antipsychotic drug, all of those are examples of treatment methods that are based on the biological perspective, because each of these assume that if we can manipulate specifically neurotransmitter levels, we can hopefully alleviate the symptoms. For example, antipsychotic drugs are used to treat schizophrenia, psychotic disorder back from Unit 7, that would manipulate neurotransmitter levels, specifically dopamine in the context of schizophrenia. Another one that's technically an example would be electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. We talked about this back in Unit 7, but that's particularly useful when treating treatment-resistant mood disorders like major depressive disorder. That would be an appropriate example when ECT would be used. But that also tries to, as we kind of alluded to back in Unit 7, almost turn the brain off, turn it back on, and hopefully that can be used as a treatment method. But that again goes back to a key topic that a biological psychologist would study. So in review, if you were to see a question that asks, how would a biological psychologist view this situation, or what topics might a biological psychologist focus on? The key ones are all under the neuroscience umbrella. Things like the neuron itself, neurotransmitter levels, acetylcholine, dopamine, endorphins, etc. Brain function as a whole. We're talking about the lobes. We're talking about interior regions like the hippocampus for memory, etc. Or just studied the effects of genetics as a whole, particularly focusing on twin studies.